Imagine this. You are the axis around which an entire world spins. Your phone hums before dawn. A friend in crisis, a colleague's panic, a family member's last-minute plea. By noon, you've soothed 3 fractured souls, fixed 2 disasters not your own, and absorbed enough second-hand chaos to drown a lesser person. By midnight, you collapse into bed, your mind still drafting replies to unasked questions. The strange part? You crave it. The exhaustion feels like proof of your worth. The chaos is your crown. Without it, who are you? But here's the silence beneath the noise. When you close your eyes, there's a hollowness where your own voice should be. You've memorized the fears of everyone you love, yet you flinch when asked, "What do you need?" You've become a cathedral for others' prayers, but your own altar lies empty, dust gathering on the parts of you that once burned with private hungers. There's a question clawing at your ribs, one you've buried under a mountain of "I'll handle it, and they need me." What happens when the world no longer needs you, or worse, when you no longer need to be needed? This is the addiction no one confesses, not to their therapists, not in the glow of midnight honesty. It's subtler than substances, more insidious than screens. It's the narcotic of indispensability, the belief that your value is measured in the desperation of others. You don't have relationships, you perform them. Love becomes a series of rescues. Respect becomes a currency paid in crises averted. And the moment the phone stops ringing, the terror creeps in. If I'm not the savior, am I even a person? Think of the mother who forgets her own birthday but orchestrates flawless holidays for her family. The CEO who thrives on midnight emergencies but dreads silent weekends. The friend who's everyone's rock but dissolves when alone. They're not martyrs. They're prisoners of a paradox. The more they're needed, the less they exist. Why does this happen? Why do we conflate being necessary with being alive? Dig deeper and the contradictions multiply. We're taught that selflessness is virtue. Yet what if the need to be needed is the most selfish act of all? A way to control others' love, to outsource our worth, to avoid the terrifying work of facing ourselves? Carl Jung called this the shadow of service, the unconscious bargain where we trade autonomy for approval. Friedrich Nietzsche saw it as the last gasp of slave morality, where the weak wield dependency as power. But here, in the quiet ache of your unspoken fatigue, it's simpler. You've mistaken being useful for being loved. And now, the very role that once made you feel invincible is devouring you from within. Ask yourself, when did "I'm here for you" become "I don't exist unless you're broken"? What parts of you died to keep others breathing? What would happen if you stopped? This isn't hypothetical. It's happening now, in the way your hands shake when there's no crisis to solve, in the dread of empty calendars, in the ghost that stares back when you glimpse yourself in a mirror, unrecognizable beneath the armor of competence. The addiction isn't to helping. It's to the identity you've built atop a foundation of others' needs. Strip that away, and who stares back? A stranger? A void? Or worse, someone with desires too dangerous to name? But here's the secret simmering beneath your fear. What if being needed is the distraction, not the purpose? The ancients whispered of this. The Greek myth of Atlas, condemned to hold the heavens, not because the gods required it, but because he refused to let go. The Buddhist parable of the empty boat, how we collide with others not by fate, but by our insistence on steering. Even modern psychology hints at it, the counter-dependent who mistakes hyper-competence for freedom, not seeing the chains beneath the armor. You stand at the edge of a silent revelation, one that will unravel everything you've built, one that demands you ask, is this a life or a slow suicide of the soul? But to answer that, you must descend into the dark. What force compels us to turn love into labor? Why does the mind cling to a role that devours it? The roots are older than you think, buried in the neurobiology of reward, the existential terror of insignificance, and a society that profits from your self-erasure. The addiction isn't personal, it's by design. You don't crave the chaos, you crave the confirmation. Every time someone says, "I don't know what I'd do without you," your brain registers it as a survival signal. Dopamine floods the synapses, cortisol retreats. for a moment, you are invincible. Not because you've achieved anything, but because you've been chosen. This is the neurological trap. The brain confuses being needed with being safe. Evolution wired us to seek tribal approval. Exile meant death. But modernity has weaponized this instinct. Now, your worth isn't tied to hunting skills or fire building. It's tied to how indispensable you can make yourself in a world that confuses utility with humanity. Let's dissect the poison. Carl Jung called it the helper's shadow, the unconscious belief that love must be earned through sacrifice. In his clinical work, he found that chronic rescuers often harbor a secret self-loathing. By fixing others, they avoid fixing themselves. The more they pour into external voids, the quieter their inner void becomes, or so they think. Jung warned, the most terrifying thing is to accept oneself completely. To stop being needed is to risk that confrontation. But why does the mind prefer this masquerade? Neuroscience offers a clue. When you solve someone's crisis, the brain's anterior cingulate cortex, the region tied to empathy, fires in tandem with the nucleus accumbens, the reward center. You get a literal high from saving others. Over time, this loop rewires your identity. You become a drug to those around you, and they, in turn, become your addiction. The psychologist Gabor Mate frames addiction as a response to trauma, a way to soothe the unbearable. Ask yourself, what trauma are you numbing by making yourself indispensable? Friedrich Nietzsche saw this dynamic as the ultimate inversion of power. In On the Genealogy of Morals, he dissected how the weak manipulate the strong through guilt, turning service into a cage. Slave morality, he wrote, says good to all that humbles and diminishes. By glorifying self-sacrifice, society ensures you'll never revolt. After all, how can you demand freedom when you've been taught that freedom is selfishness? Jean-Paul Sartre took this further. In Being and Nothingness, he argued that humans cling to roles, the martyr, the hero, the caretaker, to escape the anguish of freedom. To choose yourself is to accept that life has no inherent meaning. But if you bind your worth to others' needs, you can pretend your purpose is preordained. Sartre called this bad faith, lying to yourself to avoid the terrifying responsibility of self-creation. Aldous Huxley's Brave New World envisioned a society pacified by pleasure and distraction. But our world thrives on a subtler vice, the commodification of care. Social media algorithms reward the performative helper, the influencer who turns empathy into content, the friend who curates their identity through public acts of service. Meanwhile, capitalist systems profit from your inability to say no. Burnout becomes a badge of honor. Boundaries are framed as betrayal. You are conditioned to believe that rest is laziness and self-preservation is sin. Arthur Schopenhauer, the philosopher of pessimism, saw this cycle as inevitable. In Studies in Pessimism, he wrote, "We forfeit 3/4 of ourselves to be like other people." The addiction to being needed isn't a personal failing, it's a cultural mandate. From childhood, you're taught that love is transactional. The parent praised for their selflessness when they abandon their dreams. The student rewarded for staying late, not for thinking deeply. You learn to equate visibility with value. If no one needs you, do you even exist? Viktor Frankl, the Holocaust survivor and psychiatrist, wrote that those who have a why to live can bear almost any how. But what happens when your why is borrowed? When your purpose is a patchwork of others' emergencies? Frankl's work reveals the dark underbelly of the helper's high. Without an inner compass, you become a ghost in another's story. You trade meaning for function. And when the crises fade, when the children leave, the projects end, the friends heal, you're left staring into an abyss no act of service can fill. This is the silent tragedy. You've been taught to worship at the altar of giving, but no one taught you how to receive, how to want, how to say, "This is mine, and I will not negotiate it." The addiction isn't just psychological, it's spiritual, a starvation of the soul. And yet, there's a part of you that knows. that whispers in the rare moments of stillness. This isn't love. This is fear wearing a mask. But to tear off the mask is to face a question that chills the blood. If I am not the savior, what am I? The answer lies in the shadows, and the shadows always demand payment. What does this addiction do to you when left unchecked? How does it corrode relationships, warp ambition, and hollow out your capacity for joy? The consequences are not abstract. They live in your nervous system, your failed marriages, your stifled creativity. This is not a metaphor. This is autopsy. You don't notice the erosion until the ground gives way. At first, it's subtle. The friend who only calls when her marriage crumbles. The partner who forgets your favorite song but expects you to memorize their sorrows. The boss who praises your reliability while sidelining your ambitions. You tell yourself this is love, loyalty, duty. But beneath the surface, a rot spreads. Relationships become transactions. Your name becomes a synonym for fixer. And slowly, imperceptibly, you cease to be a person. You become a function, a tool, a shadow in someone else's light. This is the paradox of the needed. The more you give, the less you exist. Your mind becomes a haunted house. Sleep evades you, not because the world is loud, but because silence terrifies. In the dark, without crises to solve, you confront the void where your desires once lived. You scroll through old photos and realize you've become a stranger, someone who laughs at others' jokes but forgot their own. Friends describe you as selfless, but the word stings. When did selfless become code for self-erased? Neurologically, you're trapped in a feedback loop. Each time you rescue, fix, or soothe, your brain releases dopamine, the same chemical that fuels gamblers and addicts. But the high fades faster each time, demanding greater sacrifices. Soon, you're inventing problems to solve, stoking others' dependency, because the alternative, stopping, feels like death. The amygdala, wired for tribal survival, screams, if you're not needed, you'll be abandoned. So you push harder, bleed drier, while the prefrontal cortex, the seat of self-awareness, atrophies from disuse. Psychologists call this compassion fatigue, but that's a lie. It's not compassion, it's compulsion. Love becomes a ledger. You tally debts. I nursed you through grief, so why can't you see I'm drowning? Resentment festers, but you swallow it, fearing that honesty will revoke your worth. Partners, friends, and children learn to weaponize your guilt. I thought you cared, they say when you hesitate, and you cave. Not realizing this is how empires of codependency are built, brick by guilt-laden brick. Therapist offices are littered with casualties of this war. The wife who planned her husband's career but forgot her own name. The son who inherited his mother's trauma like a family heirloom. As the philosopher Simone Weil warned, attention is the rarest and purest form of generosity, but you've given yours away in scraps, leaving nothing for the one life you're responsible for, your own. Culture conspires to keep you hooked. Advertising sells you self-care as a luxury, not a right. Treat yourself, but only after you've earned it. Corporations glorify hustle while dismantling boundaries between work and worth. Social media turns empathy into performance, where viral tragedies demand your outrage but offer no resolution. You're caught in what the sociologist Hartmut Rosa calls social acceleration, a world that equates speed with virtue and self-sacrifice with morality. Even religion and philosophy, once guides to meaning, are twisted. The Bible's greater love has no one than this becomes a mandate for martyrdom. Buddha's compassion is warped into endless giving, ignoring his warning that you yourself, as much as anybody in the entire universe, deserve your love. The result? A society of exhausted deities, each worshiping at the altar of others' needs while their own souls starve. Viktor Frankl's warning echoes here. Despair is suffering without meaning. But what happens when your suffering has meaning, just not your own? When you've poured your purpose into others' voids? The existential toll is catastrophic. Creativity withers. Joy becomes a spectator sport. You marvel at artists and rebels, wondering how they dare want so boldly, while your own dreams gather dust in the attic of your mind. The Japanese have a term for this, karoshi, death by overwork. But there's no word for karojisatsu, the slow suicide of the spirit. Your mind becomes both prisoner and warden. Confirmation bias filters reality. You notice every cry for help but dismiss your own whispers. The sunk cost fallacy chains you to toxic roles. I've invested too much to quit. Even memory betrays you, editing the past to paint your servitude as noble, scrubbing the moments you dared want more. Worst of all, you gaslight yourself. They need me, masks. I'm afraid to be alone. I'm just caring, hides. I don't know how to care for myself. The brain, desperate to protect its fragile identity, spins lies so convincing you'd swear they're sacred. The mother who dies 10 years before her funeral. The CEO who retires into depression. The activist who burns out saving a world that never asked to be saved. We call them heroes, but their stories are cautionary tales. As Jung noted, the most terrifying thing is to accept oneself completely. Yet without that acceptance, we build lives on fault lines, waiting for the quake. You feel it already, the cracks in your facade. The migraines that morphine can't touch. The friendships that dissolve when you stop performing. The haunting sense that you've spent your life painting a masterpiece only to realize it's someone else's canvas. There is a way out. Not through balance or boundaries, but through rebellion, a total recalibration of what it means to live. The path is not for the faint of heart. It requires burning bridges to your old self and facing the wilderness within. But on the other side awaits a truth so liberating, it rewires your DNA. You've been lied to. They told you rebellion is selfish, that setting boundaries is cruel, that wanting more makes you a traitor to love. But here's the truth they fear. The only way to save others is to first betray them. This is not self-care. This is war. Begin with a funeral, yours. Not the body, but the role. The martyr, the fixer, the human crutch. Bury it. Light a match to the identity you've spent decades building. Let the flames illuminate what you've avoided. You are not responsible for the world's hunger. This is Nietzsche's Übermensch in action, the act of self-creation that terrifies the masses. In Thus Spoke Zarathustra, he writes, "You must be ready to burn yourself in your own flame. How could you become new if you have not first become ashes? Burn. Let the people who called you selfish recoil at your smoke. Their outrage is proof you're alive. Selfishness is not a sin. It's a sacrament." The word derives from self-ish, to be full of oneself. Not narcissism, but sovereignty. The poet Audre Lorde wrote, "Caring for myself is not self-indulgence. It is self-preservation, and that is an act of political warfare." Start small. Decline a request without apology. Ask for help. Say, "I want," and let the sentence hang, sharp and unadorned. Watch the world fracture. Some will flee, their love conditional on your compliance. Others will lean in, curious about the heat you're radiating. These are your allies. The rest are ghosts. Your brain will fight you. Every unmet plea will trigger withdrawal, sweating palms, erasing thoughts, the phantom buzz of a phone that isn't ringing. This is detox. Lean into the ache. Let it teach you what you've avoided. Your worth is not a transaction. Neuroplasticity demands repetition. Rewire the circuits. When the urge to fix arises, freeze. Ask, whose need is this? Replace "I have to" with "I choose to." Even if you choose the same action, the shift in agency is revolutionary. Practice radical irrelevance. Spend an hour doing something that serves no one, not even yourself. Stare at a wall, taste the freedom of uselessness. They will call you a monster. Parents, lovers, friends, those who profited from your silence, will weaponize guilt. "You've changed," they'll say, as if change is betrayal. Nod. Agree. Then ask, "Why did you need me to stay small?" History's great emancipators faced this. The abolitionist who left church pews full of outraged parishioners. The suffragette disowned by her family. As Sartre wrote, Freedom is what you do with what's been done to you. Your rebellion is not a rejection of love. It's the first real love you've ever offered yourself. Here's the forbidden question. What do you want? Not what you should want, not what would make others proud. The raw, unedited truth. The childhood dream you buried. The rage you swallowed. The erotic hunger that frightens you. Carl Jung's shadow work is key here. In the Red Book, he warns, until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate. Sit with the parts of yourself you've exiled, the lazy, the greedy, the too much. Let them speak. Their demands are not flaws. They're the blueprint of your becoming. Rebuild your relationships on ruins. To the friend who only calls in crisis, I can't save you, but I'll sit in the dark with you. To the parent who equates love with obedience, I'll disappoint you now so I can love you later. To the world that demands your exhaustion, no, this is not cruelty. It's the most profound act of integrity you'll ever commit. As the philosopher Simone de Beauvoir wrote, to be free is not to do what one wants, but to want what one does. Want fiercely. Let your desires carve canyons through the wasteland of old roles. You've been taught anger is dangerous. But what if it's your compass? Rage at the years spent shrinking, at the lies sold as love, at the societal script that equates self-erasure with virtue. Harriet Tubman channeled fury into liberation. The Buddha transformed his princehood into pilgrimage. Your anger is not a flaw, it's fuel. Burn the old contracts. Forge new ones in the fire of I will not. This is not the end. The final revelation is not about fixing or fighting, it's about annihilation. The ultimate truth will force you to confront a reality so raw it dissolves the very concept of self and other. What remains is not peace, but power, not light, but lightning. The storm was never in the world, it was in you. All this time you believed the addiction to being needed was a flaw, a weakness to overcome, a habit to break. But here's the lightning strike. It was never an addiction. It was a funeral, a burial rite for the parts of you too alive, too hungry, too dangerous to exist unchained. The role of savior wasn't a prison. It was a sanctuary, a way to hide from the primal truth that you're not here to be useful. You are here to be. Let that sink into your bones. You've spent a lifetime believing in a lie, that there's a you and a them, that love is a bridge between separate islands. But neuroscience shatters this delusion. Mirror neurons, the brain cells firing when you watch someone else suffer, reveal a staggering truth. There is no other. When you drown in another's pain, you're not empathizing, you're dissolving. The existentialist Jean-Paul Sartre glimpsed this when he wrote, "Hell is other people." But he missed the inverse heaven. Hell is believing you're only real through others' eyes. The savior complex isn't altruism, it's existential vertigo, a refusal to stand alone in the universe, naked and unobserved. Viktor Frankl was wrong, not about suffering, but about purpose. He believed meaning could be found. But the ultimate truth is this: meaning isn't found, it's forged. In the moments you stop trying to matter to others and start mattering to yourself, in the audacity to want without apology, in the recognition that your existence needs no justification, it is its own gospel. The Japanese concept of ikigai, reason for being, is a pretty lie. You don't have one reason, you are the reason. The universe didn't place you here to fix, save, or serve. It placed you here to rupture, to disrupt the myth that worth is earned, to burn so brightly that others must reckon with their own shadows. Here's the ritual. Stop asking, "What should I do?" The word "should" is a coffin. Shatter it. Replace "why me" with "why not me?" The first is victimhood. The second is revolution. Let your hunger speak, not in whispers, but in guttural howls. The philosopher Émile Cioran, who danced with nihilism, wrote, To exist is to protest. But you've been protesting the wrong verdict. Your rage shouldn't scream, "Notice me." It should roar, "I am already here." Let's crucify the lie that love is sacrifice. True love isn't a transaction. It's a collision. Two whole universes crashing into each other, not to fill voids, but to create new galaxies. When the poet Rumi wrote, "You are not a drop in the ocean. You are the entire ocean in a drop," he wasn't flattering you. He was issuing a warning. Stop shrinking your tides to fit others' deserts. The moment you stop needing to be needed, relationships transform. The friend who stays? They're not there for your utility. They're there for your electricity. The partner who remains? They don't want your sacrifices. They want your storms. You stand at the cliff's edge. Below you swirls the abyss Nietzsche described, the one that stares back. But here's what he didn't say. The abyss is not your enemy. It's your reflection. Jump. Not into darkness, but into the truth that's been howling beneath your ribs. You don't need to be needed to exist. You already are. The universe didn't birth you to be a tool. It birthed you to be a question mark, a wildfire, a singularity. The addiction was never the problem. It was the breadcrumb trail leading you here, to this moment of annihilation. To the understanding that you cannot save anyone until you stop trying to save yourself. When you walk away from this page, the world will test you. Phones will ring, crises will erupt. Old ghosts will whisper, "Who are you without us?" Do not answer. Light a match to the script they gave you. Let the flames write a new one in the ashes. And when they ask, "Who are you now?" smile. Burn brighter.